Anyway, I want to welcome you here. Thank you for coming. Dr. Ken Pargament is an internationally known researcher in spirituality and psychotherapy and health. Written books, papers. He's a visiting scholar to the Institute for Spirituality and Health here in Houston, of which I worked with them. That's how I got to know Ken. And he's actually a professor at Bowling Green University. He's done a lot of empirical studies. And I must tell you what I told the Northwest Deanery, that I've stolen some of his material and included in my homilies. So you may want to take some notes if you're deacons or priests or whatever. But he's just absolutely fantastic, gentle, very humble, but really got a lot to offer. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ken Pargament.
Thank you, Bob. Can you hear me okay? Am I loud-mouthed enough? Okay. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the wonderful dinner. I really enjoyed that. Having a kind of home-cooked meal. Used to eating out here a lot, and every time I come down, I seem to gain another 3 pounds. So I've been coming down this year to Houston and the Institute for Spirituality and Health 1 week a month for the last 12 months. So this is my last formal talk before I go back and re-engage my usual life. But I've had a wonderful time this year interacting with people at the Institute for Spirituality and Health, which is part of the Texas Medical Center. And we have a fabulous group of people at the Institute whose mission is to build awareness of links between spirituality and health, generate more knowledge about those connections, and disseminate it. So I'm a disseminator right now. I'm going to be disseminating some information to you, and I hope you do find it interesting. Part of the reward, too, has been meeting such wonderful people like Bob Hesse, who has deep interest in contemplative prayer, John Graham, who's the CEO at Institute for Spirituality and Health, who is both a physician, an ENT, plastic surgeon, and an Episcopal priest, and some wonderful people in the medical center doing fabulous, fabulous work. So it's been a really exciting year for me. Things have changed a lot since I entered this area of study, and I did my first work in this area in 1976. So I've been at it for a while. I started when I was 4 years old, so I'm still incredibly young. But I remember I gave my first talk to the psychology department at a university, and it was 1977. And I had a very interesting reaction. I was talking then about the relationship between religion and mental health. And I thought the talk went pretty well, even though I was pretty nervous. And afterwards, the chairman of the psychology department, a very distinguished man, came up to me, and I'm standing here, and he comes up to the podium, and he leans over to me, and he whispers, "I'm Catholic." Well, fortunately, being trained as a clinical psychologist, I knew exactly what to say. I leaned over to him, and I whispered back, "Oh." "Oh" is a great response. It works every time in any situation. Then I whispered again, "Why are we whispering?" Well, he got a little embarrassed, and he, very distinguished man, says, "Well, you know, psychology, being Catholic, they don't exactly mix." Well, that was a sign of the times. In 1977, people whispered about religion if you were in psychology or medicine or any of the healthcare professions. It was something people whispered about. Things have changed, times have changed, and now I can talk to groups of people and I can talk with full voice. I don't have to whisper anymore, which is a real gift. What I'd like to do tonight is, in a way, say some things that I doubt are very surprising to you. I'm going to talk to you about the links or the points of connection between spirituality and health. And I'm going to talk about it from the point of view of both a researcher, which is what I do, and a clinician, because I still see people in psychotherapy. So I'm going to give you examples from both research and clinical practice that illustrate how spirituality is a vital dimension of healthcare. And I'm going to address the question of, well, why should we put the two together, spirituality and health? But by the end of this talk, I hope you'll be convinced, as I am, that the real question shouldn't be why should we put spirituality into healthcare. The real question should be, what's taking us so darn long? Now, I've given this talk before, and I think other groups have found it useful, not because you need to be convinced, in some ways I'm preaching to the choir, but because the data I'm presenting can be very useful in your conversations with skeptics to help you marshal the arguments for why this kind of integrative work is so important, because I'm sure you will encounter a great deal of skepticism, as I have in my work. Well, let me start then with a clinical story, and this is a story of a case I saw many years ago now. The story of Alice. Now, I saw Alice. She was a 45-year-old woman, very plainly dressed, no makeup, straight hair, and she was coming in because she had been dealing with bipolar illness for many, many years in her life. She was first diagnosed when she was 13 or 14. And she'd had a roller coaster of moods for much of her life and had been treated by psychiatrists, medication, psychologists, by many people in the Toledo community, which is where I'm from. She'd been hospitalized on and off many times over the years and had recently had to quit her job because she was quite disabled. When I saw her, I was no more successful in my first year of work with her than anyone else. She was hospitalized 3 or 4 times in the midst of terrible periods of depression, when she became suicidal, hopeless, and filled with despair. I tried to do all the typical things that we do in psychology to help her with her medication, tried to help her through the therapy, and nothing seemed to work. And she's a lovely, lovely woman, just a very caring woman. Her hobby was therapy dogs. She would take therapy dogs out to hospices, hospitals, other groups that were suffering, and when she was able to do it, she just brought light into many people's lives. So I really liked Alice a lot and felt horrible that I wasn't able to help her gain more stability in her life. But one day she comes into the office, crying hysterically, talking about wanting to die, not wanting to live, having a plan to kill herself once again. And I'm thinking to myself, oh gosh, I gotta get her to the hospital again. I'm not helping this woman. What can I do? Just feeling like so awful for her. At one point in her crying, she kind of moans, oh, when will my suffering end? And I listened to that and I thought, Alice didn't usually talk like that. She never really talked much about her religion or her spirituality, and even said she wasn't particularly religious. But when she said, oh, when will my suffering end? I thought, that's almost biblical, a lamentation. So I responded using similar language myself. I said, Alice, where do you turn to for solace in the midst of your suffering? Now that's not my typical language. I don't usually use solace much in my language. I'm not a solace kind of guy. But it seemed appropriate. And she heard me and she stopped. She paused and she looked at me. And she slowly said, well, I've never mentioned this to anyone before, but when I was first hospitalized, I was about 14 years old, and they put me in the rubber room, with restraints so I wouldn't hurt myself, and I thought I was going to die. They didn't explain anything to me. I was just restrained, and I thought I was going to die, and I was crying and crying. And then I started to feel a warmth in the center of my chest. And it started to spread through my body. and the warmth spoke to me. I said, like anyone would say, or ask, what did the voice say to you? She said, the voice said to me, I'm with you, I'll always be with you. Alice, who was speaking to you? She said, oh, that was God. God was telling me that no matter what, even when I hit the worst of times, the darkest of the dark, God would be with me. I was like kind of stunned. I said, Alice, has that ever happened to you since then? Did you ever hear God's voice speaking to you? And she said, oh yeah, I hear it a lot when I'm hitting bottom. Whenever I'm at the bottom of I'm in my pit, I hear God tell me, I'm with you, I'll always be with you. She says, and sometimes I sense it too when I'm with other people who care about me. She said, like now. Then she says, don't you feel it too? Well, typically psychologists are trained to say, well, how do you feel? Or flip it back to psychologists. But I thought that would have been a cop-out. And I said to her, because I just felt this incredible sense of sacredness in the room. I said to her, Alice, I do feel it. Yeah, I do. And we were just quiet. The rest of the session was spent talking about her spiritual experience. And the interesting thing was that in talking about it, Alice had stopped crying. She was no longer hysterical. Her mood seemed to be pretty stable. And I asked her further into the session, do you feel well enough to go home without hurting yourself? And she says, yeah, I do. I said, could you sign the contract we have for her not to kill herself? That's a suicide contract we often use. She says, yeah, I can do that. I'm feeling pretty good right now. It's interesting because the therapy, my work with her, shifted in large part to focusing on how could she access her spiritual sense of connectedness more regularly in her life, not just when she was hitting bottom. How could she begin to integrate her faith into her life more fully, more completely? That was the single most helpful thing I did with Alice. And it was a turning point because she began to do this. She got more involved in her church. She got more involved in prayer and exercises to kind of build her spiritual disciplines. And I worked with her for another 10 years, and she wasn't hospitalized other than one time in the next 10 years. Now, this is a woman who would be in the hospital 3 or 4 times a year. She wasn't hospitalized. The one time was when her mother died, and she was only hospitalized for 2 days when her mother died. It made a huge difference, integrating spirituality and treatment. The other thing I want to mention was at the end of that session, that pivotal session, as Alice is leaving, I said, you know, Alice, you said something to me that I found interesting. You said you've never mentioned this to anyone before, and she was a real veteran of mental health services. She'd been through all the therapists in Toledo. I said, how come? How come you haven't mentioned this experience? You know what she said? She said, well, they already think I'm crazy. Here she was, keeping the most important resource in her life secret from mental health providers, from physicians, psychologists, social workers. She had never mentioned the single most important resource in her life because she felt that we would see it as a sign of her craziness. After all, she was hearing God's voice. Well, psychologists, psychiatrists, as a rule, don't understand that about 30 to 40% of the population in the U.S. hears God's voice. There's nothing weird or crazy about it. It's pretty normal for people of faith to feel or sense God's presence in their life. Nothing strange about it at all. And in fact, it's very helpful, very healthy for many people. Alice wasn't crazy. What I'd like to start with this talk with is just talk a little bit why there's such tensions between medicine, psychology, and spirituality. And I think we need to take a look at why the tension. Why is there such tension? Let me just note that part of it is that the major leaders in our field have tended to be pretty anti-religious. Sigmund Freud, that's a picture of Sigmund Freud when he was a young guy, said that religion works by distorting the picture of the world in delusional manner. He said it fixes people in a state of psychical infantilism and draws them into a mass delusion. Basically, he's saying that religious people are a bunch of big babies, not willing to face life head on. And Freud had tremendous influence in the development of psychiatry and medicine. Many, many people were trained in the Freudian tradition, and he still has large influence today. More recently, Albert Ellis, a founder of a major school of thought in psychology and psychotherapy, maybe went even further than Freud. He out-Freuded Freud. He said, obviously the sane and effective therapist should not go along with a patient's religious orientation and try to help them live successfully with their religion. This is equivalent to trying to help them live successfully with their emotional illness. Pretty nasty stuff. Actually, to be fair to Albert Ellis, he had a conversion experience later in his life. Not a formal conversion experience, but he became more sensitive to religion later in his life and decided he had overstated things. And he actually wrote a book with some other people, a very good book on integrating religion and health. So he had a change of heart. But these are some of the reasons why we see this kind of tension that the leaders in the field have demonstrated it. But how do we explain it? Well, there's a history here. DSM-3, which is one of the earlier versions of the kind of psychiatric Bible for diagnosing people with mental disorders, provided many religious examples of psychopathology. So if someone was schizophrenic, DSM-3 had lots of examples of religious hallucinations. People hearing God speak to them, or religious delusions, people believing that they're Jesus Christ, which gave the impression to many psychiatrists that religion is a source of hallucination and delusions. Part of the problem, too, historically, has been that there's very little written about religion and spirituality in the training of most physicians, most mental health professionals. The education is very limited. There's very little mention of these terms in education. Now, the tension, I think, actually comes from both sides, because religious groups have not been particularly happy with the medical system, and especially psychiatry and psychology. I came across this quote from a conservative religious couple who had this to say. Oops. They said that psychological systems of counseling, so therapy, leads a person along the broad way to destruction. The entrance into new life through faith in Jesus is the small gate. So this book is a real criticism of psychology and psychiatry. The book is called Psychoheresy. Psychoheresy. Very critical of psychology and psychiatry. So you can get the tensions coming from both sides, from the medical side and from the religious side. How do we explain it? Well, I think one reason has to do with the desire of psychologists and psychiatrists in particular to establish themselves as hard scientists. Psychology originally was actually a field very interested in religion. The founding fathers of psychology were very interested in religion. Psychology, the word psychology, psyche-logi, means the study of the soul. Psyche-logi is Greek for the study of the soul. So what happened? Well, in the 20th century, when medicine was becoming hard science-oriented itself, psychiatry and psychology wanted to join the bandwagon and to be hard scientists. And they tried to do everything they could to avoid any association with anything that hinted of superstition, magic, faith healing. These were the things they tried to stay away from at all costs. we still see some of that kind of antagonism to anything that may bear any resemblance at all to religion today. Another explanation for the tension is that health professionals are weird. Now, by weird, I mean in a specific sense. Weird as being Western, educated, industrialized, rich, I don't know about that, and democratic. But the real point of this is that maybe the better word would be health professionals and researchers are abnormal. Does that sound better? We're abnormal? How are we abnormal? We're abnormal in the sense that we're very unlike the people that we work with. Let me give you an example from a survey that was done. If you ask the general population in the US, do you believe religion is very important or fairly important? About 90% of Americans say yes. What happens if you ask psychiatrists? 56%. If you ask people whether they believe in God, in the US, 96% of the general population believes in God. If you ask psychiatrists, it's 73%. If I pick on my own group, psychologists, it's 27%. I'm part of a group that has the highest percentage of atheists of any profession, 27% believe in God. If you ask whether people believe in life after death to the general American population, 71% says yes. Psychiatrists, 48%. That's what I mean by weird or abnormal, that psychiatrists are not like the people that they treat. It's true for physicians as a group as well. Physicians as a group are also weird and abnormal because they're generally a higher proportion of atheists, irreligious, not involved in churches or temples or synagogues. And so that means that on average, patients who may be believing in God, involved in religious life, may be seeing physicians, psychiatrists, psychologists who are not involved in that. It creates what we call a religiosity gap, a gap. Now, we don't want to make too much of it because there are many physicians who are devout, and there are people in the general population who are atheists. But overall, there's this kind of tension between people who go into healthcare, or maybe the way we train people in healthcare to become skeptical, and people in the general population. And that may be another reason why we have this tension. Another reason for the tension may be, in some ways you could argue that religion and medicine, religion and mental health are competing religions. Now my son is graduated from medical school, and I was really struck at the ceremony, the graduating ceremony. They have a white coat ceremony where they're basically given this kind of religious looking garb, a white coat. And it's a very religious kind of ceremony. And so we have that, we have medical people speaking their own language. It's mysterious because physicians are taught never to write legibly, right? And there's its own system of symbols and rules and language system that you could argue is a competitor to religion. Certainly there's differences in language. For instance, in values. In the world of health and science, we value research, individualism, skepticism, being pragmatic. In the language of religion, we hear different values and words being expressed. We hear the words of faith and love and humility and surrender and transformation. How often have you heard that in the medical office? Some doctors are starting to talk like that, but it's not very common. This is not the language of science. And yet, there's some competitiveness perhaps in these language systems. Is there in fact a way to join them? Well, yeah, there is. In fact, right now, there's fascinating research beginning on love, on transformation, on surrender. We're beginning to study these human virtues systematically and learning a great deal about them and their value to health and well-being. So things are starting to merge. But in the past, these are separate worlds. Well, maybe the simplest explanation for the tension is that people in the health world just don't have training or knowledge. I think this actually is the best explanation. Very few people in medicine get training in spirituality or religious issues, and so they just don't know what to do when it comes up. For instance, only 65% of psychiatrists report they never talk about religion or spirituality in training. 65%. And yet we know how religious many people are. This is really quite odd. Many physicians describe barriers that get in the way of talking about spirituality and treatment. 35% say, I just don't have time to do it. I got too much on my plate, and now you want me to talk about spirituality? Forget it. Others are concerned that they're going to offend their patients. If they talk about spirituality, then they're going to put their patients off. Others complain about insufficient training, and some say they're just uncomfortable with it. Well, why then should we integrate spirituality into training? I'm going to give you a research-based rationale, okay? So you might find some of these data interesting. First of all, religion is a cultural fact. Psychologists rarely use the word fact, but I think fact applies here. It's a fact that our culture is a religious culture. For instance, in a national survey done a few years ago, in the US, 68% of the population believes in angels and demons. 59% believe in hell. 58% pray daily. 57% agree we have to believe in God to be moral and have good values. And 40% report attending religious services in the last week. That seems to be a little inflated. There were some studies that have recently been done to actually track people, whether they're going to church, and compare their actual behavior. Did they show up in a church versus their self-reports about how often they go? People, believe it or not, exaggerate how often they go to church. I'm sure that would never happen here. Okay. Well, whatever the reason for this gap between religion and spirituality in healthcare, the end result is that when a patient comes in who may mention something religious or spiritual, the physician may be left not knowing what to do, jumping over the subject, just feeling uncomfortable, trying to be totally neutral, which, as we're going to see, is impossible. You can't be neutral about religion. Everybody has strong feelings about it. Even the diehard atheist has strong feelings about religion. The most reasonable response would be to get more training. Let me talk then about why it makes such good sense to integrate spirituality into training. In addition to it being a cultural fact, patients want it. If you ask patients, do they want spirituality integrated into healthcare, patients generally say, yeah, I'd like that. They'd like to see their clinicians raise or talk about spiritual issues. For instance, in one study of patients from different counseling centers, only 18% said they didn't want to talk about religion with their counselor, with their therapist. In another study of people with serious mental illness, 65% said they wanted to talk about spiritual issues, but only 35% did so. Like Alice, they didn't feel safe talking to their counselors or their physicians about religious or spiritual issues, so they kept it to themselves. And how many of them were like Alice? How many of them were experiencing their faith as their most important resource? It's particularly true for elderly patients. The majority of elderly patients would like to talk about spiritual issues in the counseling and in their medical care. but relatively few actually do so. Another reason why this kind of integration is important is that spirituality is a resource for so many people. Let me give an example, and I always wonder why I include this one when I'm flying. But it's a story of a plane crash. Some of you may remember this. Back in the 1980s, there was Flight 232 going from Chicago, I think it was going out to Seattle. And it was flying over Iowa, and the tail of the plane exploded. Some people were killed right away. And the plane starts to go down. The plane was, 30,000 feet up in the air. So it's going to take a few minutes for the plane to go down and crash. Well, the pilot was able to get some kind of modest control, so the plane did crash, but it was a controlled crash. I'm not sure if there's such a thing as really a controlled crash. Relatively controlled. And there were some survivors. Well, any of you remember Life magazine? Remember Life magazine? Life magazine went out to interview the survivors and asked them this question: what were you thinking? What were you doing when the plane was going down? Good question, right? I mean, ask yourself, what would you be thinking? What would you be doing if the plane is going down, the tail has been blown off, and you probably think you may be heading to your death? You're facing the end of your life. Well, I read those interviews, and virtually every interview, the survivor on the flight said something religious or spiritual that they were doing in those last few minutes. Virtually everyone on that plane. Here are just two quotes. One guy said, "The plane was moving erratically. I knew it wasn't good by increasing activity of the stewardesses. The guy next to me at -4 minutes said, we ain't gonna make it. I noticed the nun across from me had been praying like a rosary. I remembered I had a cross in my pocket. I pulled it out and held it in my hand for the rest of the ride." Lots of people were holding on to crucifixes, religious objects, sacred objects as the plane was descending. Even non-traditional religious people were doing something that had to do with their philosophy or faith system. There was a Buddhist on the plane, and he said that, well, I'd done a lot of Buddhist meditation in my life, and this trained me to become one pointed in my awareness. That's a Buddhist value, to always be focused on the moment, the present moment, the here and now, and to be pointed in your awareness of that present experience. I was totally focused on the brace position. You know the brace position? You're taught to go like that when the plane is going down. So he's holding on to his Buddhist philosophy, living out his Buddhist values to the last second of his life. I really don't know if the brace position does a whole heck of a lot. I mean, just know what you think. I'll date myself again, but do you remember, those of you who are old enough to remember the 1950s and the nuclear scares with Khrushchev and all of that, and how we had nuclear tests where the kids in school had to go into the hallway? Any of you remember that?
Yes.
I thought it was kind of silly. And my wife told me that when she was going into the hallway, they had the girls in the hallway, they had to put their skirts up over their heads. And I thought, a nuclear bomb. I don't know what kind of good having a skirt over your head is going to do with a nuclear bomb. I wonder if that's the same thing with the brace position. Is it really, planes going brace position? I don't know. You do what you can do. This isn't unusual. That studies are very clear that in the most desperate moments of people's lives, people often draw on their faith as a vital resource. Study following 9/11, 90% of the American population sought solace and support from religion. among people with serious mental illness. 80% say they cope with their symptoms through religion, and 60% find it helpful. 30% say it's the single most important resource of all of their resources. It's true for caregivers of patients with illness. Caregivers also frequently look to their faith for support in coping with the stresses of caregiving, which can be incredibly difficult and stressful. In this study, 90% of caregivers coped by praying to God, and 50% found solace from their faith in coping. My students and I have done many studies on this topic with these various groups: soul, divorcees, physically abused spouses, medically ill people. And the findings are all consistent, that large numbers of people turn to their faith in stressful times. For some people, it's the single most important resource. They'll turn to God before they turn to family, friends, or physicians. God is the first source of solace and support for many people. Now, it's not true that there are no atheists in foxholes. There are some atheists in foxholes, but relatively few. Most people will find that their religious impulse quickens, comes to the foreground in difficult times. Let me add to that it's interesting that it looks as though this is even more true for minority groups, blacks, Hispanics, and it's also the case that minority groups appear to have special benefits from their faith. That faith for minority groups seems to be even more helpful than for the general American population. There's something especially empowering about faith to people with fewer resources. And religious institutions can offer unique access to underserved populations. I'll give you an example of that. I was working with a friend of mine is an African-American public health professional at Johns Hopkins, and she's been very interested in prostate cancer. Rates of prostate cancer and mortality are especially high among African-American males. And it turns out that African-American males are much more reluctant to seek out prostate cancer screening and testing than other males in the United States, which may be why rates of prostate cancer are higher, but also mortality rates are higher because it's not getting caught and treated as often. So she thought about, well, how do you get African-American men into treatment, into preventive care? And she said to herself, maybe through the church. Because African-American men do show up in the church. They may not show up in medical centers very much, but they come to church. So she brought together the leaders of the major African-American denominations in the United States, and together they sat down and tried to figure out a way to encourage African-American men to get prostate cancer screening. Now, prostate cancer screening is not a treat for anyone, for any male. You know, it can be pretty invasive. But she worked with the pastors, the leading pastors, and they developed pulpit messages to encourage African-American men to seek out prostate cancer screening. These were like sermons about prostate cancer in the church. And as far as I could tell, it was pretty successful, or at least her pilot program, because they were able to draw on the unique access the church provides to underserved populations. There have been a lot of other public health interventions now that are designed to access underserved populations through the church. Really interesting work. Let me note here, too, that there's something very special about religion and spirituality here. It's not just a tool to enhance physical health. Religion and spirituality provide people with an overarching organizing vision. Overarching organizing vision for life. If you define yourself as Roman Catholic, it's not just a label. Being Roman Catholic is a higher order value, and it has implications for many aspects of your life. How you raise your children, how you live your life yourself, what are your ultimate values and dreams, what you find acceptable, what you find unacceptable. Being Roman Catholic is a higher order organizing principle. And if you're Roman Catholic, your life is going to look different than if you're Muslim, if you're Jewish, if you're Buddhist, because those are different organizing principles. And we know that this is the case. We also know that spirituality provides unique tools for coming to terms with human finitude. I like the way an anthropologist once set the stage for this idea. This is an anthropologist, and he said, "The events through which we live are forever outrunning the power of ordinary, everyday, moral, emotional, and intellectual concepts to construct them." Meaning, the events that we live in our lives, they confound us. They go beyond the ways that we typically have to understand them. Life continues to throw surprises at us, things that we can't understand with our ordinary concepts. We're constantly confounded. And Geertz goes on to say, these events leave us, as a Javanese image has it, like a water buffalo listening to an orchestra. Meaning it's like there's so much going on, and we're like a water buffalo with all this stuff going on around us, and we don't have a clue. Well, I think that says something about spirituality. Spirituality suggests that it offers some concepts and values for understanding that we are, in fact, finite, limited, insufficient beings. And I want to contrast this with the general American way of looking at ourselves in life. The American way is all about mastery and control. In the U.S., we're all taught to take control. It's the John Wayne kind of philosophy here. You take control, you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you make the most of your life. If there's a problem, solve it. That's the American way. And I think that's great as far as it goes. The problem is, we're finite, insufficient, frail, finite creatures. And there's always that part of life that we just can't control. There's always going to be the uncontrollable part of life. And what do you do about that? Most problems have an uncontrollable aspect to them. How do we come to terms with human limitations? Well, the American way doesn't help us with that. And the movies that we see with heroes like John Wayne, they're not very good at showing us what do you do when you reach the end of your rope. What do you do when all of the scientific methods, engineering methods, physical health methods aren't doing anything for us? What do we do when we face our mortality? That's where religion and spirituality come in. That's where we need a different set of concepts like surrender, transformation, faith, hope, prayer. And I believe that both sets of concepts are important. Mastery and problem solving in John Wayne, but also being able to let go, being able to pray, being able to turn it over to God, being able to just look for hope. And they're both part of living a full, complete life. So there's something special going on here that spirituality has to offer. In fact, and this is some of the most exciting work, research studies show that spirituality is tied to better health outcomes. There's some really very exciting work that's been done, and maybe you may be aware of some of this. I'll give you a few examples. Here's a study done by Hummer and his colleagues. Now, this paper was published in a very top-tier journal called Demographics. And they followed a national sample of adults over many, many years and found that, on average, adults who attend church frequently, once a week or more, live 7 years longer than adults who don't attend church as frequently. There's a 7-year life expectancy advantage for people who attend church frequently. For African Americans, It's a 14-year advantage. Now, researchers are trying to figure, and this finding has been replicated 20 times. It's a well-established finding now. The more often you go to church, the longer you live. Pretty basic. But why would that be? Any guesses? Who do you think? Why does church attendance relate to a longer life?
Relieve stress.
I'm sorry, relieving stress. Other ideas?
Lifestyles.
Lifestyle, healthier. If you go to church, you may live a healthier lifestyle. Other things? Some people say maybe it's having a meaningful philosophy of life. Some people say it's the social support, that church is community. And with church, you have a convoy, that one writer talked about it this way. He says, in church, you have a convoy that follows you over the lifespan. And even if you're in old age and you're 100 years old, you may have lost many of your family and friends, but you still have a convoy. Well, all of those explanations have actually been tested, and they don't seem to account for the full picture of why people who go to church live longer. I have my own hypothesis I'll share with you. It's never been tested, so this is all just, but I'd love to test it. I think people who go to church more often live longer. The reason for that is because they're regularly exposed, I sound like a doctor here, they're regularly exposed to a high dosage of positive spiritual emotions. What are positive spiritual emotions? Uplift, awe, gratitude, love, compassion. Where else do you regularly get that? Maybe in your family if you're lucky, but I have a very loving family, but we do a lot of things besides show love and compassion. Pick up those socks! Dad, will you take me to the mall? There's lots of stuff going on besides positive, uplifting emotions. But I think that exposing yourself to these positive emotions has really powerful physical health benefits. Improves the immune system, improves physical functioning. And how could this be in a church? Well, I think the community connectedness in the church, the religious messages can be so uplifting, the homilies can be uplifting, the music can be incredible. And this may sound a little biased, but I've visited many African American churches, and I think African American churches generally do a better job than white churches in presenting people with a dose of positive spiritual emotion. They're really good at it. And maybe that's one reason why African Americans get twice the benefit of white Americans by going to their churches frequently. Of course, there's a warning to this message, and the warning would be, if you're going to a church where the music is really bad and the sermons are really boring, it could kill you. If it works one way, it can work the other. And you may have been around some churches where the music's pretty tough on the ears, and I think it can have deadly implications. Other studies have also shown that measures of religiousness are tied to a variety of good outcomes: well-being, happiness, less depression, less risk of suicide, less alcohol and drug use, less delinquency. The findings are very compelling, very compelling. I've been involved in some research lately that I'll just add an example of this, to look at the implications of religion for health and well-being of the family and the marriage. A lot of this is about individual health and well-being, but what about the family and marriage? Does religion facilitate family functioning, marital functioning? Well, let me tell you one study we did. It was very simple. We asked married couples whether they saw their marriages as sacred. To what degree do they see their marriage as sacred? The simple thing was, we asked some people to complete this. Do you see your marriage as sacred? Do you see your marriage as very important but not sacred? Do you see your marriage as not important and not sacred? Those are the couples in trouble. But the comparison we were interested in was couples who see their marriage as sacred, it's a covenant, it's a sacred vow, versus couples who see their marriage as a contract, a legal contract. It's very important, but I wouldn't use that religious language. And what did we find? We found that couples who saw their marriages as sacred were less likely to engage in destructive fighting. They didn't do name calling. They didn't undercut each other as much. They treated their marriage as sacred. So they protected it. And as a result, they experienced greater marital commitment, greater marital satisfaction, and a host of other benefits. These findings have been replicated now, that couples who see their marriages as sacred have a lot of benefits to it. We're learning a lot more about the benefits of religion for marriages. For instance, we've just completed a one-year study of couples, married couples having their first babies. And we found that what was most predictive of the couples making it through that very stressful year of having a baby, what was most predictive of the couple's health, well-being, and love for each other was a variable that we called spiritual intimacy. Spiritual intimacy means that you feel safe sharing your spiritual beliefs and feelings with your partner. You feel your partner responds with openness and caring, and your partner feels safe sharing his or her spiritual thoughts and feelings with you, and you respond with openness and caring to your partner's deepest conversations. That measure was predictive of increased love and satisfaction and commitment over the course of the first year of having a baby in the family. So that's really kind of exciting. So we're really interested in this notion of relational spirituality. That spirituality is not just an individual variable. It's something that has to do with marriage, family, and children. And there the findings fit with the other findings that it seems to be helpful for many, many people. Okay. Well, to be balanced and fair, I also want to point out that spirituality and religion in some forms has also been tied to poorer outcomes. We can identify some types of spirituality that are destructive. Now, are you surprised by that? No, I mean, we know we've got plenty of examples in the world today of bad religion, destructive spirituality. And let me just illustrate with some research we've done on what we call spiritual struggles. Spiritual struggles have to do with tension and conflict with God, with other people, or within oneself. I'll give you a couple of examples so you get a sense of this. There's nothing unusual about it. In the Bible, we hear plenty of stories of spiritual struggle. In Psalms and Jesus on the cross, we hear, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Struggled. Struggles with God. In Job, the book of Job, struggles. Jacob wrestling with the angel, struggling. It's a part of the religious journey. But it's not just a matter of history. This was really interesting. I was giving a lecture to my undergraduate class in psychology of religion about struggle. And the next day I get this email from one of my undergraduates. And this is what she wrote. I knew she had bipolar illness, but I didn't know anything about her struggle. She wrote, "I'm suffering, really suffering. My illness is tearing me down, and I'm angry at God for not rescuing me. I mean, really setting me free from my mental bondage. I've been dealing with these issues for 10 years now, and I'm only 24. I don't understand why he keeps lifting me up just to let me come crashing down again." Hear that struggle with God? We find that even among undergraduates, struggles are not unusual at all. Struggles are not unusual. People experience struggles with their faith and with God. People experience struggles with other people. One of my colleagues did a study on interpersonal conflicts in the church. And boy, did he have a lot to go on here. This was such a rich study. He found lots of complaints about gossiping, cliquishness, hypocrisy. Boy, did that get people going. You know what? If you're at a boring dinner party and you want to get some conversation going, just sit back and say, "So what do you think about hypocrisy in the church?" Guaranteed to create some interesting discussion. Now, I'm not invited to many dinner parties anymore. And one woman said, well, they get off in a corner and talk about you, and you're the one that's there on Saturday working with their children and washing the dishes on Sunday afternoon. They don't have the Christian spirit. Boy, people really reserve a lot of bitterness for that feeling that their members of their church are not there for them, or hypocritical, or aren't there for them in the midst of their illness. Just tremendous bitterness around that as a source of deep struggle. And I want to point out, too, that there are the intrapsychic struggles that people experience. And the kind that I think are most important are feelings, for instance, that you're not living up to your own spiritual values. In cases of addiction, for instance. Or just misbehavior, that you're letting yourself down and the people around you down because you're failing to live up to your higher spiritual self or values. And here's a study that showed among vets with PTSD that many of them were experiencing a lot of guilt and shame for what they had witnessed or participated in the Mideast. These are spiritual struggles. And they found that these struggles were tied to greater use of mental health services. So these struggles, I think, are quite potent for people. We've done additional studies, and I'm not going to belabor them now. But one study I want to mention is that among elders hospitalized, we found that people who were spiritually struggling when they came into the healthcare system, they were in the hospital with all kinds of illnesses, patients who were struggling spiritually with their illness were more likely to decline in their physical health and mental health over the next 2 years. They were also more likely to die. Struggles were tied to greater risk of mortality, which is the first study of its kind that's shown that that could be. In particular, patients who believed that God was abandoning them in the hospital, patients who believed God didn't love them or questioned God's love for them, patients who believed the devil was making their illness happen, they were all more likely to die over the next 2 years. We've done additional research since then showing that people who are struggling with their faith have declines in their immune system, which may be one of the factors that's contributing to greater risk of mortality. But all of this says that there are some problematic forms of spirituality for people, and we need to pay attention to that. When I present these findings to hospital chaplains, they go, well, yeah, of course, that's why we're needed. Hospital chaplains try to identify people who are struggling and sit down and talk with them and try to help people resolve the struggles before they cause damage. So hospital chaplains look at this and they really like these findings because they justifies some of it kind of provides them with a reason for their work. Or those of you who may be volunteer chaplains, this justifies the work and says why it's so important to talk to people and visit with people who may be struggling. Okay. I do want to mention that I found these kinds of results, they were a little surprising to me, because as a psychologist, I always thought that struggle could be a good thing, that people grow through struggle, that it's struggle that produces growth and transformation. And in the Bible, not just the Judeo-Christian tradition, but within Islam and Buddhism too, there are lots of examples of religious figures, Jesus, Buddha, Moses, who have periods of struggle, and then they come through their dark times, their desert periods, transformed, right? So I thought that would happen here too, that people who struggle would have good results, not bad results. Well, in fact, there's some evidence that that's true as well. We also find that people who struggle often do report growth. Right now, we think of it as a fork in the road. Struggle can lead to growth or can lead to decline. And the critical question may be, how do we deal with struggle? What do we do with struggle? Okay. I'm going to move on because I know it's getting warm in here and you guys are being great sports. So I'm going to move on to the last point, which is why should we integrate spirituality into treatment? that we're beginning to do it right now, and it's showing promise. We're developing treatments now that are more spiritually integrated, and they have some encouraging results. Let me show you one study in particular that I really like, because I did it with a colleague of mine. This was a study on, and this is a study on people with chronic migraine headaches. No problem getting to participants, because migraines are a terrible problem. I'm sure some of you have migraines. We were interested in seeing whether or not the kind of meditation or prayer that was explicitly religious would be more helpful than a kind of meditation that was secular. There's a lot of research on meditation now, and most people say you don't have to be religious to meditate. You don't have to be religious to meditate. Well, Amy Wachholz, who has a master's degree in divinity from Boston University, she's Roman Catholic, and we are really interested in seeing whether or not, in fact, the religious nature of the meditation may add something to its power. So we taught these people with migraine headaches, one group we taught to meditate to a religious phrase, God is peace, God is joy. Another group we taught to meditate to a secular phrase that was also positive, I'm content, I'm joyful. Or grass is green, sand is soft. And another group we taught them just how to relax their muscles. We then measured changes in their headache frequency, their tolerance for pain, and other outcomes. Now you may wonder, well, how did we measure tolerance for pain? Well, there's a task called, that's commonly used in psychology, called the cold pressure task, in which you ask participants to stick their hands in ice water and hold it as long as they can. I don't know if any of you have ever done it. I did it because I wanted to see what I was asking my poor participants to do before I put them through it. And I can tell you, it really hurts. It's very painful. Ice water starts to burn pretty quickly. It feels like you're sticking your hand in fire. But you're supposed to keep your hand in there as long as you can. And we time them. That's a measure of pain tolerance, which is very relevant for people with migraines. Well, look at the changes that took place and focus on the solid red line. That's the line for the group that was the spiritual meditators. This is the number of headaches before and after treatment. And you'll see that the spiritual meditators had a sharper reduction in headache frequency than the secular meditators, or the muscle relaxers. Pretty striking finding. When we asked them to keep track of their headaches on diaries, look at that, look at the solid red line. Frequency of headaches over time. The spiritual meditators had a much sharper drop in frequency of headaches. Now look at pain tolerance. Look at that. How long did they keep their hands in the ice water? The spiritual meditators kept their hands in the ice water twice as long. Remarkable finding for people dealing with chronic pain, and suggests that the spiritual meditation is much more helpful in helping people learn to live with some pain. Of course, you could say that maybe spiritual meditators develop poorer judgment, that they would even leave their hands in the ice water. I'm wondering about that. It's a voluntary experiment. Who would put themselves through it? But they did. And we had other findings that were also consistent. So negative affect. Spiritual meditators have a sharper drop just in their negativity. And in migraine-specific quality of life, so the quality of life, how disruptive is the migraine in their lives, they become much less disabled by the migraines. So these findings have now been replicated in 2 or 3 other studies. And we're really excited about it because it suggests the value of an explicit, spiritually integrated treatment that may have value in reducing reliance on medication. But it says that a spiritually integrated treatment adds something above and beyond traditional secular treatments. Okay, I could keep going, but I want to show you one final example of an intervention that we've done that I think is pretty neat because it's pretty new. And let me see if I can get to it. Okay. Yeah. This is really cool. We were asked by the U.S. Army to develop a educational program for every soldier in the Army to help them develop what they call spiritual fitness. Spiritual fitness. This program came out of the initiative of a general who had been captured by the Iraqis in the Iraq-Iran war, or in the Iraq-Kuwait war, had been tortured. And she saw the need for a program that would help build resilience and fitness among soldiers before they enter combat. Makes perfect sense. Why wouldn't you build resources before you run into trouble rather than just wait to treat people after? I thought it was such an exciting idea. It's part of a larger initiative now, you can look it up online, Comprehensive Soldier Fitness, where soldiers are taught to develop fitness physically, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. So she asked us at Bowling Green to develop the spiritual fitness program that's now online for soldiers. And let me just give you an example of some of the things we did to help build spiritual fitness. We are really interested in helping soldiers anticipate the struggles they're likely to encounter in the military, including spiritual struggles. Now, I don't know if you've read USA Today, but there's the lead article in USA Today was the dramatic rise in suicides among combat veterans. It's a huge issue. More people now in the military, far more people are dying of suicide than anything related to combat. And the rates of suicide are higher than they've been for years among the military. And now the rates are going up among people who are more mature, among people in officers. People who are more experienced in the military are killing themselves at higher rates. And PTSD is more common. Well, we think our program that helps equip soldiers to deal with the struggles they're facing before they face them makes perfectly good sense. And here's some of the work that we've been developing. One dimension that we're working on, and soldiers look at this online, is called seeking spiritual support. And we help them learn about spiritual resources that they can draw on when they're deployed. And we give them examples about why it makes sense to use these resources, where they can turn to for help, including chaplaincy, a higher power, a battle buddy. We have another module that focuses on the use of rituals. So we talk about connection rituals, coping rituals, rituals with water, transition rituals, and we talk about the rituals they can involve themselves in through their chaplains. Rituals is a way of facilitating key transitions in military life that are often forgotten and lost when people are overseas. We talk about meditation. We teach people to meditate through this program. Contemplation, meditation. We're teaching them different meditation strategies, breathing, active walking, guided visualization, phrase meditation. And we teach people how to make meaning of their situations that may be very difficult to make sense of. So here, for instance, we give soldiers the example of Lieutenant Martinez, who accidentally kills a civilian and is feeling guilty. We then ask them to process some different ways they could make sense of this horrific accident, to help them learn how to find meaning-making strategies that they can live with. This is pretty radical stuff for the military. We've had to be very careful not to use the G word. Can't talk about God in the military. Separation of church and state. But we did get away with higher power. We can't use church a whole lot, but we can use chaplains. So we've had to be really careful putting this together. And we had to face a lot of trouble with, my name online, you can pull it up and see a lot of groups in the country, atheist watchdog groups, have attacked me as kind of like a evangelical, right-wing crazy for putting this program together. I had one person wrote, "You have no business encouraging soldiers to make meaning of their situations. That's something they should learn to do at home. You're trying to foist your idea of God on them." Really? I mean, you can't ask soldiers to make meaning of death and suffering. These soldiers are killing themselves because they can't make meaning. They're dealing with PTSD, depression. They're becoming alcoholics and drug abusers and family violence, that I think is all connected with inability to come to terms with their struggles. So I think this is really an exciting initiative. I hope it'll continue for a while, but it suggests some of the exciting things that can happen when we integrate spirituality into the healthcare system. So let me just conclude here by, again, highlighting why it makes sense to integrate spirituality into treatment and training, and lots of good reasons. And I think then the real question isn't why should we integrate spirituality into healthcare. The real question is how can we do a better job of it? How can we do a better job of it? And let me just leave you with this final thought, that spirituality is a key dimension of what it means to be human and a vital part of holistic care. Okay, I'm going to stop because I know it's hot. You've been great sports about this. And do we have time, Bob, for a few questions? Or?
So we had scheduled until 9.
Okay, so any questions?
I think I got the fan working. We'll see if that
Okay,
helps.
any questions or comments? Happy to get any feedback. Yes.
In your study of that people live longer if they go to church, was there a distinction between people who just go to church or those who are involved and active in their church?
It doesn't really break down that way. It's just going. It's a very basic kind of finding. So we know that people vary in their level of involvement, and we know people go to church for a variety of reasons. Some people go because they want to be close to the Lord. Some people go because they want to make friends, or they want to look good in the community. But it didn't seem, in this study at least, just going seems to be the benefit for whatever reason. So really kind of interesting, isn't it? And we're still trying to figure out what is it that's so special about church attendance, because the effect is almost as great as the effect of stopping smoking. As a matter of fact, I had a guy tell me once, he said, look, I'm having a real hard time stopping smoking. If I go to church regularly, can I go back to smoking? And I don't think that's the meaning of the finding. I would use that result that way. You just imagine not smoking and going to church regularly, you're going to live to 120. Other kinds of thoughts or reactions to this. Yes?
Where can you find more about this stuff?
More about this kind of work? Yeah, there's some great resources out there. There's if you wanted to look at the kind of popularizations of it, there's some really good books. Just go to any bookstore and you'll see books out there now on spirituality and health, and they cite a lot of this kind of research. If you want a book that's more into the spirituality into treatment, I have a book called Spiritually Integrated Psychotherapy, which presents, I have a lot of this in there, so you might enjoy that. I didn't want to.
Has any of this been applied to the prison ministry?
Yes. It's a great question. Yes, in fact, it has. And the studies seem to suggest that, you know how it's a terrible thing to try to encourage prisoners to move away from a life of crime. And very few programs have shown any effectiveness at all, in part because prison is just such a miserable place to be. How can any good come out of it other than protecting society from people? But the one program that seems to show some effect is a Christian-based program, which is teaching basically a Bible-based program to prisoners where Bible study. And the Bible study program has shown more promise than anything in prisons. Now, there are problems with it because the only program that's been really tested is a Christian program, so what do you do about the large number of people from other faiths in prison? And it needs to be extended. Very interesting work there, though. Yes?
Are there any Christian-based psychology programs, like PhD programs around the country?
Yeah, there are. There are some good ones. Fuller Theological Seminary, the Evangelical School in Los Angeles, California has a program. There are the Regent University, Pat Robertson's school in Virginia has a very good program. Biola University in California has a good program. Wheaton University in Illinois has a good program. So there are probably about 5 to 10 programs in the U.S. that train really good Christian-oriented therapists and researchers. There are a few secular universities that do this, my university, Bowling Green State University, University of Connecticut. And I have many of my students have come out of Christian undergraduate schools, and they want to work at a Bowling Green because they want to be exposed not only to Christian groups and Christian approaches to psychology, they want a broader approach, but they're going to take it back to their work with Christians. So they just want broader training. So I think there are a lot of ways to approach it. And there's some really good programs. Yeah, it's good to see it happening. In medicine too, there are medical schools now. Many medical schools, with the support of the Templeton Foundation, are now including some kind of spiritual training for first-year medical students and residents, teaching them how to ask a few basic spiritual questions in the diagnostic interview and intake interview, and to then address religious or spiritual concerns that could come up. There's one program that teaches oncologists, oncology physicians, how to ask questions about religion and spirituality in the first interview. And the program has increased the satisfaction of patients with physician care, and the oncologists like it. Nowadays, with the change in medical care, the Affordable Health Care Act, there's going to be a lot more emphasis on demonstrating the effectiveness of medical services, including patient satisfaction. So this kind of research is really important, showing, I think, the research that shows that spiritually sensitive care enhances patient satisfaction, and there's no doubt that it's going to happen, is going to really push the field forward, because it's going to mean more money to hospitals that increase their satisfaction through spiritually sensitive care. So I think this is going to become a growth industry. Other thoughts? Yes?
Just a comment. I'm a physician, and there's been a remarkable change in the last 5 or 10 years in the way patients interact in the hospitals. You would never hear a patient talk about spiritual matters to the doctors. Now when I make rounds, patients will say, ask, how are you doing today? They'll say, I'm blessed. Very common response to see in the hospitals now.
Yeah.
Or before surgery, they'll say, doctor, will you pray with me? Or after surgery, yes, let's thank God together. But these kinds of expressions are coming from the patients themselves, wanting more spirituality to be involved in their patient care. But it's coming from the patients themselves. There's more recognition that God does work in our lives through those people around us.
Yeah.
But it's a remarkable change we're seeing. My students are seeing that, nurses are seeing that. It's a totally different attitude that's coming about.
Where are you at?
I'm at St. Joseph's Medical Center downtown, also at Methodist Hospital.
I agree. I think we've kind of passed over a certain threshold in the last 5-10 years. When I started, I told you the story about the whispering, my Roman Catholic department chair whispering about being Catholic. I used to be able to keep up with this literature by going to the library twice a semester, spending a leisurely day and just enjoying myself, reading a few journals, and not to be totally caught up in the field. Now, I can't keep up with it with access to every journal in my own office, because articles are coming out every place you can imagine: nursing, medical, philosophy, theology, psychology journals. And it's also in popular media. So patients are hearing about this and they're responding to it. It's, I think, always been the case that patients have wanted this care, spiritually sensitive care, but now I think we're moving to the point where they're seeing that it's okay to bring it to the surface and to talk about it more directly and openly. And many physicians are now kind of doing that themselves as well. They've also kind of been impressed by the literature and feel a kind of new freedom to, ask, would you like me to pray with you, to a patient who's just been diagnosed with cancer, or someone who's going through a life-threatening illness, or just raising the possibility, not imposing it, just raising the question. And, it gives people a whole, I think it creates opportunities for healing moments in medical care that haven't been there before. That's what I'm really interested in studying right now. We're doing some research now on what I call sacred moments in medical care. And it strikes me that what sustains physicians and nurses in medical care, particularly those who are working in the toughest trenches of oncology, end-of-life care, palliative care, what sustains physicians and nurses in that work, chaplains too, I think it's having these profound encounters with patients through prayer, through a sense of transcendent connectedness. And I don't think they're rare. When I ask people to describe, for instance, a sacred moment they've had in medical care, physicians can do it, nurses can do it, patients can do it. We've never asked them to do it, but when they do it, boy, is there power there. And I think it's those sacred moments with patients that allow medical people to stay in the field, because it allows them to kind of make the transformation themselves from being totally overwhelmed and burnt out from dealing with dying patients again and again, to feeling blessed, fortunate, grateful to be able to be with people in such pivotal transformational moments. And that's the way many people feel about working in oncology or working in pediatric oncology, where you're seeing children die regularly. How do people sustain themselves? Well, they have these wonderful opportunities to be with people in their most sacred periods, sacred moments. So I'm really interested in understanding that. And then, how do we help physicians and patients? I don't think you can create those moments, because I tend to think there's something godly about them. We don't create them. I think we can screw it up. You know, I mean, I can tell you a few basic things about how to make sure you never have a sacred moment with another human being. You know, in medicine, for instance, I just teach a physician to don't make eye contact with the patient and focus totally on your computer when you're doing your interview. And you're guaranteed never to have a sacred moment. Maybe you'll have a sacred moment with the computer, but not with a human being. So I don't think we can create it, but I do think we can cultivate it. It's like somehow creating the soil, creating the atmosphere for it, and then hoping, praying that the sacred moment emerges or is given as a gift. And that, I think, is a really exciting direction for psychology, medicine, all helping professions. Yes?
Just a comment. A year ago, I was diagnosed with melanoma. And I think for the most part, when people hear the C word, cancer, the tendency is to come unglued. Or ask the question, why me? Because of my faith, I asked the question, why not me? But when I met with the oncologist, first the surgeon, and finally the radiation oncologist, and then the regular oncologist, I let them know where my faith was. And I did that for two reasons. One, I wanted to know where they were with faith and spirituality. And number two, I really wanted to put them at ease. Take stress off them, if you will, because I'm not knowing where they're at, I wanted to know where I was at. And I could
Very nice
accept
of you.
it.
Yeah.
You know, it's the acceptance and it's the surrender. That no matter how this goes, I'm comfortable. And it's made a wonderful relationship with all three of the oncologists that I've had contact
That's
with.
wonderful. One of the key elements, I think, to sacred moments, and you helped induce one there possibly, is connecting to someone as a human being. And you had the compassion to connect to your physician as a human being. And many patients don't see physicians as human beings and would not think about trying to respond to their physician and their physician's needs. You're being sensitive to your doctor. And being able to kind of shift. In Martin Buber, the philosopher, talked about shifting in our relationships to other people from I-it relationships, where we treat other people like objects, to I-thou relationships, where we treat other people as carriers of a sacred spark, where we see the deeper dimension to the other person. And then we begin to connect to each other as thous. We connect to each other as full human beings. And that's where you get the sacred moments. Not that there's not value to I-it relationships. You want your physician to also know how to do surgery and to diagnose and to treat your body very much like an it. You know, I want a very skilled it-oriented therapist, physician, but you also want somebody who you can connect to as a human being and who will connect to you as a human being. But I like your story because you kind of went first, which is unusual. Yes.
I'd like to make a comment. Early in my diaconate career, I was going to Memorial City to visit people. And the medical professional would come in, get out of the way, I'm here to be sure. And I wasn't doing anything. I mean, they really put me down, and I thought that was a terrible thing.
Yeah.
That time, and I'm glad to see it's changing.
Yeah. I spent, one of the wonderful things I did here, I was really fortunate, I spent some time on the palliative care unit at MD Anderson. And I have to admit, I was a little frightened. I'd never been on a palliative care unit. I didn't know what to expect. But I went there, and it's very team-based. So they have a team of physician, chaplain, nurse, social worker. They go out and talk to the patients and talk to the family members. It was the best day. I mean, these patients and family members were just surrounded with sensitivity and caring and compassion. And I thought, boy, if I need to be in palliative care, I want to come here. Because it just took my own fear away, the idea that you could be, and that it kind of instilled real hope that you could be treated as a human being. The other thing I want to mention was the most important person on that team was the chaplain. They deferred to the chaplain, the physician, the nurses, because the physician had to largely just focus on managing pain medication, which is pretty mechanical. But the issues that were coming up were not major league pain issues that I heard. Most of the issues were the spiritual issues. For instance, a father was, his 28-year-old wife was dying, and they had 2 children. And he was talking to the team about, how do I explain this to my kids? In the past, the nurse, the physician, and the social worker looked to the chaplain, and he was right there. He said exactly what he needed to do in a loving, caring way. And that happened throughout the day. The key issues were the issues that the chaplains were dealing with on palliative care. And boy, you could tell who was the real leader of the team in that setting. So boy, that would not have happened 25 years ago. I mean, that was just radically different. And I thought that's some of the best care I've ever seen. So yeah, they're promising signs. There's still plenty of room to go. I mean, I'm going to be heading back to my psychology department at Bowling Green, and believe me, the attitude to this kind of work is still very different. I mean, I'm tolerated there. They like me as a person because I got a good sense of humor, and I don't bother them, and I'm nice. But there's a difference between being tolerated and appreciated for the substance of the work. So there's plenty of room for growth in psychology and medicine. We still got a ways to go. So maybe we should leave on that note. Okay.